Right. Cool. So yeah, I mean, first off, thanks a lot, Skylar, for inviting me to talk. I'm really excited by the idea of, of university classes and of students that are really interested in things like social enterprise and new ways of doing things, new ways of doing business, and new modes of human social organizing in the age of the internet. It's much, much more exciting than anything I was ever engaged in at university, and much more sort of practical and tied to the real world. So it's great to be talking to you. So I'll just talk a bit about, you've got a little bit of background context already. So I'll just talk a little bit about, I guess, a bit more about my background and how I came to be working on this thing in this faraway place, and talk a little bit about, I guess, where Loomios come from, how it works, and then I'll go into quite a lot about the types of groups that are using it and the sorts of things that they're using it for, from social movements through to governments, through to communities. And then it'd be great to have some time for some discussion, some back and forth. I'd love to hear people's take on what we're doing. And I'll talk a bit about how it's applied in university context as well. And it'd be great to get some thoughts on that from the class. So I'll just jump straight in, So my background is in something quite different. So a few years ago, I was engaged. I started a PhD at a university in Scotland. I was researching the evolution of collective intelligence. I ended up getting sent to, I was doing a lot of field work. I got really interested in the question of, so I was looking at the evolution of collective intelligence among humans, and I was really interested in this question of why human cultural complexity is the total accumulation of socially transmitted information in human culture is increasing in complexity over time. And as far as we know, humans are the only species that do this. So this is a phenomenon that in academic circles they call, in evolutionary psychology, they refer to it as cumulative cultural evolution. This idea that with every generation we can do things that the previous generation was unable to do. And the internet's a really clear example of that, and has really dramatically increased the speed with which that complexity is increasing as the cost of transacting information becomes lower and lower and people are more connected than ever before. So to look at this question, I was sent to Texas to do field work. I was working with chimpanzees, teaching them to use touchscreens. And, it was this really interesting, it was really interesting in theory, really interesting in an academic sense. And at the same time, just felt so disconnected from anything happening in the real world. I'm doing this work at a primate sanctuary during the day. And then every evening I'd go home and just be flooded, mainly through social media and through online sources, but just be flooded with all these images and news articles and commentary about things going really seriously wrong in the world. And, sitting there with this question in my mind, increasingly prevalent of, well, if people are supposedly becoming more intelligent collectively over time, why is it that our biggest institutions, our economic, political, social institutions seem to be making decisions at a systemic level that are increasingly stupid, that are, putting everyone's future at risk and the future of the planet, seeing ecosystem collapse, economic turmoil, governments failing, social upheaval. And I just started feeling more and more like that's the question that I needed to be working on. How to leverage human intelligence, human collective intelligence, in the context of systemic change and in the context of institutional intelligence. How can we use the internet to increase the ability of institutions to make intelligent decisions at a collective level? And so, there were a bunch of different factors, one being that cops shot one of the chimps I was supposed to be working with. So the primate sanctuary, and also finding out that the primate sanctuary was actually a front for a massive breeding center. They were breeding thousands of owl monkeys and squirrel monkeys to sell into the pharmaceutical industry. This whole series of factors just led me to feel like that was not the place for me. And I ended up coming back to New Zealand with this real desire to work with real people in real communities. I got really heavily involved in and grassroots activism around human rights and social justice causes. And then in 2011, when the Occupy Wall Street movement happened, there was an International Day of Solidarity on October 15th, 2011. And this is after this, this wave of social movements through what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt, through the Arab Spring revolutions, then through the Indignados and 15M movements in Latin America and Spain. And then October 15th was this, and then to Occupy Wall Street. And then October 15th was this International Day of Solidarity, where all of a sudden, in more than 1,000 cities around the world, the same type of movement had sprung up in solidarity with what was happening in Wall Street. So, I mean, to me, this felt like a different kind of social movement. This wasn't something that I had seen before. This was, this wave of mass, rapid mobilizations for social media. So social media really bringing down the cost and within which huge numbers of people can be coordinated to engage in citizen direct action. And I guess it felt to me like, in many ways, the perfect social movement, or perfect movement of movements, in that, they were explicitly nonviolent, they were explicitly, directly democratic. So they weren't these authoritarian, institutionalized, they were much more focused on transformative change rather than this traditional conception of revolution being, one small group of people with power being overthrown by another small group of people seizing power and inflicting that on everyone else. It was much more about this nonpartisan, broad-based, grassroots, directly democratic, and actually a networked movement. And it really felt like activism of process. So the processes by which these groups were organizing, to me, was the most, and particularly looking at it through an academic lens and through the lens of collective intelligence, seeing that these groups were organized in using general assembly decision-making, using consensus-based decision-making, collective decision-making, to make decisions in a way, to organize in a way that included all perspectives in decision-making. It wasn't a small group of people making decisions and inflicting them on everyone else. It was an inclusive mode of operation, a horizontal organizing or bottom-up organizing. And we saw this happen all over the world, and here in Wellington, in New Zealand, there was, the same on a smaller scale, like everything in New Zealand. So that bottom right-hand image is what was happening in Wellington. So that's an image of a General Assembly in the Occupy Wellington camp. And this was hundreds of people coming together and talking things through and feeding diverse perspectives into a decision-making process, and just seeing through the lens of a collective intelligence in particular, seeing what groups can achieve when that process functions well was just immensely inspiring for me. And seeing these self-organizing communities able to make decisions that are more intelligent than any individual would have come up with by themselves, because every perspective can genuinely be included. So just, the breadth of information that's feeding into collective decisions, just because more people have more information in their heads, they're pulling it together, they're able to refine their ideas together, groups can make really, really intelligent decisions. And so we were struck with me and a small group of people that were involved were struck with the immense potential of collective decision-making on a really large scale. So distributed, networked decision-making on a large scale, and struck with this, this utopian vision of globally distributed direct democracy happening everywhere, in workplaces and communities. And we were also struck by the severe limitations of in-person organizing. So when you have to be in the same place at the same time in order to participate in the process, it's never going to scale. And it's also, the practical constraints of time and place alone leading to things like, the restriction on the types of people that are able to participate is really severe and leads to this distortion over time. So there's a really nice paper that was written in the 60s called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And we just saw that it's this idea that, you can have these movements that are flat or horizontal, but unless they have really well-held process for maintaining inclusive participatory modes of operating, you get these informal dictatorships emerging. You get the same power dynamics, the same, imbalances of power, and the same privileging of certain demographics emerging that we have, currently, and it can be even worse. So when loud voices dominate discussions and end up with an undue influence and group dynamics, we saw this in Occupy camps all over the world, and you see this in grassroots movements all over the world too. So, what starts off as this really nice, inclusive, directly democratic movement can end up being a bunch of angry white guys yelling at each other because no one else wants to be around. And that's what we saw over the weeks and months of Occupy camps. That's the demographic shift that we saw in front of us. So sort of simultaneously holding this massive potential for what could happen and seeing the severe limitations really motivated us to think about how we could use the internet to exchange information every day, how we could use that to translate that information into real-world collective action. And it seemed like decision-making was this leverage point, was this sort of key constraint and this bottleneck on the way that things are operating currently, and that could be, massively blown open. It's like we've massively distributed access to information and communication. We haven't yet massively distributed decision-making, which is the necessary sort of flashpoint that turns shared information into action, real-world action. So we, at exactly the time that we were having this, this utopian vision, this idea, we met up with someone who founded a social enterprise network in Wellington called Inspiral. So Inspiral started off as a collective of web developers with a social conscience who got together and started working collaboratively, ended up growing into taking over a co-working space, and then started spinning out social enterprises. So it's this really unique take on, so I guess they described to us basically, so we told them about our idea and we asked them, like, we've had this idea for groups to be able to make collective decisions online, and we asked them if they could build it for us. And their response to us was that they needed the same tool. They're a distributed network of people that can never be in the same place at the same time to make decisions. They're a horizontally organized social enterprise network with a commitment to inclusive democratic decision-making. But in practice, all their decisions are coming down to one or two people because they can never get everyone in the same room at the same time. So their response was, well, they needed it as well, but that we were going to have to get together and build it together. So they gave us a desk and an internet connection, and and it's just growing from there. So, as soon as we had a really rough prototype up and running, so this was literally, a pie graph and 4 buttons. It was full of bugs. It barely functioned. And Spyro started using it to manage their co-working space. So 60 people working in an office that we were also working out of. They also started using it at the board level and at all the other levels of the organization. So, they're using it for day-to-day decisions in the co-working space right up to strategic business decisions that affect the whole network of 150 people. And so the feedback that we were getting was really rapid. If we deploy a feature that just doesn't work, we would be literally surrounded by people who are trying to use this thing that we've built in their work every day, telling us what's wrong and how we can fix it. So this idea, it came after a few months, came into a rough prototype phase and came to be known as Loomio. So Loomio, the name came from, this idea of a loom, this idea of weaving, so weaving diverse perspectives into a coherent whole. And it also comes from this idea of illumination, so the illumination that comes with collective wisdom or collective intelligence when diverse perspectives are included in a decision-making process. And so the intention was to build the simplest possible system that enabled group to come together online, talk things through, build shared understanding and make clear decisions. So there are plenty of tools around already for, for discussing things online. And there are also tools for taking polls or, doing sort of majority rules polling, things like SurveyMonkey. But as far as we could tell, there was nothing around that combined those two things, that just combined discussion, the ability to talk about something with, a flexible way of making clear decisions together. So I'll just show you a couple of screens that hopefully convey how it works at a basic level. So, first off, you've got a group, and then within a group, you've got discussions. So anyone in the group can start a discussion on any topic. And so you can see here in this example, so this is a real example from an environmental organization that's using Loomio to organize in New Zealand, a climate advocacy group. And you've got the title of the discussion, and then you've got space to give context. So to give the group as much information as they need to have a well-informed discussion. When the discussion gets to a point where someone in the group feels like it'd be good to think about a concrete proposal to start coming to a decision, anyone in the group can put up a proposal. So a good proposal is a really clear course of action for the group to take. So when someone puts up a proposal, people can participate in it by clicking one of 4 buttons. So this is just taking the very basic elements of collaborative decision making. So, rather than just saying yes or no and going with, the majority. So, polling, if 51 people want one thing and 49 want another, then you go with the 51 and half the group is annoyed. In a consensus building process or a collaborative decision making process, it's very much this this flexible system where you state your position. So you can either agree or you can abstain and say you're happy for the group to decide without you, or you can disagree and say that it's not your ideal outcome, but you won't stand in the way of the group if the group wants to move forward with it. Or you can block or raise a red flag, which is saying I've got a really, really serious objection that I feel needs to be addressed before we can move forward. And so different groups use this in different ways. Like small, strictly consensus-based organizations, they'll use the block to mean this is, as a veto, essentially, to say, if this goes through, I feel so strongly that I'll consider leaving the group if this is what the group decides. Larger groups or groups with, with more of a rough and ready sort of collaborative decision-making model, which is the majority of groups using Loomio, they'll use the block to mean this is a serious objection that I've got that I really appreciate being addressed before we move forward. But we really set out to design a system that was flexible enough that really brought down the cost of involving more people in decision-making, involving more diverse perspectives, but didn't bind people into a mode of decision-making that doesn't fit with their organization. So, we wanted this to be really appropriate for grassroots community groups right through to, there are quite traditional companies using Loomio now. And, the way that a CEO can come in and say, I'm going to be making this decision, but I want to know what everyone thinks about it, so I make a well-informed decision. So not a consensus model, but they're still using Loomio to bring down the barriers to including more diverse perspectives in their decision-making. And so when agreement is reached, so another important part of this is that people can change their position at any time. So in the discussion, if new information comes to light, so if someone, if I initially disagree with something and then someone makes a really compelling point, I'm able to change my disagree into an agree. So you get this process of agreement building over time, and groups that are using it well, concerns that are raised get addressed in the discussion, and they're able to build shared understanding and build agreement over time. And so when a decision is reached, so the discussion is not time limited, but every proposal is time limited. So when the time limit hits, when the deadline hits, there's a clear decision on the table. So whether it's agreement or disagreement or some combination, it's obvious there's a visual indication of how the group feels and an indication of why each person feels that way. So when you make your decision, you leave a short, like Twitter-length statement explaining why you've made the decision that you've made. So what a group ends up with is an archive of the decisions that they've made together, and that they can drill into, you can see what decision was made, what the outcome was, and why each person felt that way. So, I mean, at its core, it's a really simple system. It's basically taking discussion or deliberation and decision-making and putting them together into an accessible, user-friendly system. And that focus on accessibility is really what's led it to, we just started seeing this really unexpected international spread as soon as we got a public, actually even before we got a public version out the door. So, in the really early days, I guess the first large-scale use case outside of New Zealand was this student protest movement in Hungary, who were organizing these large-scale nationwide protests. They were occupying universities. They were mobilizing against government education cuts. So the government wanted to impose these really severe cuts to tertiary education, university education. And they used Loomio on the national level. So they had networks of students using it. They had networks of academics and professors mobilizing in solidarity with the students. They had, a nationwide network of several hundred high school students who were organizing using Loomio. And that was a real wake-up call for us that we built something that, that was actually useful in the context that initially motivated us to build it. And then at the same time, we were seeing government departments in New Zealand start using it for team collaboration, and to start using it for citizen consultation and multi-stakeholder decision-making. So, the New Zealand Ministry of Justice started using it. The Wellington City Council, so this is the same city council that were during Occupy were sending us eviction notices and trying to evict us from the public space we were occupying. 12 months later, they contracted us to run the online side of their biggest public consultation of the year. And at the same time, we were seeing, businesses pick it up, social enterprises pick it up, worker-owned cooperatives, networks of community gardens in Bulgaria, community hospitals in Vietnam. Right now, the Taiwanese government is using it to run a citizen consultation around a national clean energy policy. So China Times just reported on it the other day. And they're able to use it because Taiwanese student activists translated it into Taiwanese 8 months ago when they were occupying. They were organizing these huge protests about government transparency, and they ended up occupying their parliament building for 3 weeks, barricaded themselves in. So there's this really interesting interplay between people working outside of institutions, communities using it to boost their capacity to organize effectively, and also centralized on the other side, the whole other end of the spectrum, centralized institutions that want to become more participatory, and they use it to bring down the barriers to them involving their constituencies, their communities in the decisions that they're making. So you've got this sort of thing happening from both ends of the spectrum, converging on networked organizational form, rather than traditional centralized top-down. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're moving away from this chaotic sort of tyranny of structurelessness that so many activist groups have fallen into. And this recent wave of social movements over the last few years, you see these mass mobilizations, really rapid, through Twitter, through Facebook, hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets, and then they dissipate really rapidly without having built the capacity for sustained, robust, ongoing positive change. So what we're working on is really infrastructure. So it's open source, so it's public infrastructure. The code is held as a public commons. Building infrastructure to facilitate that transition from these two types of traditional structure that are both failing to meet the needs of a rapidly evolving environment, and towards networked structures that reflect the interests and the needs of all of the different people involved, and reflect the intelligence of all of the different people involved and the communities involved. So, I mean, we're still running with the same sort of utopian vision that was driving the project right from the beginning. And I mean, we're set up as a social enterprise. We're also a worker-owned cooperative. So Loomio itself is a democratically run organization. We're a mission-driven organization, so we've got a defined social purpose that's written into our constitution. It's at the core of our organizational structure. We generate revenue to drive that social mission. So we also didn't want to be dependent on government grants. We didn't want to be dependent on traditional charity. So we're really focused on being financially self-sufficient, independent, neutral, and also like just very staunchly mission driven. So the mission comes first, and we generate revenue to further that mission and scale things out. So the stage we're at now is we're in a very late beta stage, so we're very close to having a full release out the door. And even in the beta stage, we've got 60,000 people using it in 80 different countries. People have translated it into, I think, 30 languages now, 31 languages. So communities that are using it in different countries take the code, they translate it into their own language, and then contribute it back to the community. And yeah, we're at a really exciting phase. We're also in a challenging phase where there's all this demand, there's all this potential, and we've got such a tiny team in such a faraway place that, you know, delivering on that and scaling out is really challenging. So, you know, the most difficult thing for us has been being able to resource the project to scale without compromising. So figuring out a revenue model that aligns really well with the values and the mission of the project. So that's our central mission right now. It was sort of over the last few years, it's been getting a core product that's really useful to people up and running. And now it's about really pushing to find that driver of self-sufficiency and driver of scale that doesn't compromise the values of the project, that really reinforces the social mission that's driving it. So, you know, we're committed to never selling advertising. We're committed to never having a revenue model that involves selling users' data. We're committed to having a revenue model that really lines up with the social mission and drives it forward rather than pulling away from it. Yeah, so I mean, maybe that's a good place to open up for some discussion. I guess one last thing I wanted to mention is the university use case. We've seen some really interesting stuff over the last few months. And about a month ago, law students at Harvard, prompted by a law professor, Charlie Nesson. He's a really interesting law professor. He was the legal counsel for Danny Ellsberg during the Pentagon Papers, the whistleblower in the Pentagon Papers case. He's still running something called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. He prompted his class to start using Loomio to there's this thing, you probably know more about it than I do actually, but the Title IX directive so this initiative around universities taking a stronger stance on sexual misconduct on campus. So these Harvard law students are in the midst of building a movement around pushing Harvard administration to take a strong stance, a really progressive stance on sexual misconduct on campus. And they've been using Loomio to organize within the law school first off, and they're now in the stage of scaling it out to the whole university, and then they're really motivated to push it beyond to other universities. So I don't know if Title IX is something that's big on people's minds on your campus, but it'd be something really interesting to talk about. And I mean, the other university use cases that we see are around, student co-ops pick it up, study groups pick it up, making decisions between meetings. We see within university faculty, research groups using it for making decisions across distance. Just a whole range of, universities are a really interesting test bed because there are so many people doing things collaboratively. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of plant that seed in people's minds before we open up for some discussion. So, Skylar, what do you think is the best way of...
So I'm going to go ahead. Well, we'll just open it up for questions. Anybody want to start? Yeah. And if you don't mind coming down here, you can. I think it's easier.
Yeah.
Here they come.
Great.
Wait. I just want to show you the whole room. There you go.
Great to see you.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Maya. I'm just curious, especially since what you just said about the Title IX issue, is how do you combat internet trolls and people taking over the conversations or bringing kind of the outside perspective that would go against what you're trying to do?
It's a really, really good question. So groups that use Loomio really successfully, they tend to really understand the importance of facilitation and moderation. And they also tend to understand the importance of having a really clear purpose laid out. Basically, I mean, it's really interesting designing online environments and thinking about what are the design features that are going to incentivize or increase the likelihood of productive, respectful interaction between people, and what are the design features that increase the likelihood of trolling or just, I mean, basically like YouTube comments to me are like, and news article comments as well. The design principles that have gone into those, it's almost like they're intentionally designed to elicit the worst aspects of human interaction. They're anonymous. No one's accountable for their behavior. People know that it's a cultural context in which, YouTube comments, everyone knows that that's where you go. You only put energy into that. That's the place that you write mean things about people or criticize other people making comments or criticize people in the video. It's kind of the antithesis of the environment that we're designing with Loomio, which is explicitly purpose-driven. When people join a Loomio group, they know that they're there to participate in a constructive, respectful discussion, and that people will listen to them less, not more, if they engage in personal attacks or if they engage in unconstructive behavior, which is totally not a foolproof. It really helps, and it really fosters a culture of respectful dialogue. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't. If someone's really intent on trolling or disrupting, then they still can. And that's where it's really important that the group holds a strong culture of facilitation and moderation and hold each other to account. So the coordinator of a group can delete comments. They can kick people out if they need to. And that's like a last resort sort of backstop. But generally, it's about the power of the invitation, inviting people into a cultural context in a way that really sets the bar for people understand the norms around what's expected. That really helps, and also having a backstop of being able to just remove people that are engaging in hate speech or personal attacks. Or also, I think scale is quite important. So Loomio groups tend to be groups of known people. They tend to be in the hundreds, not in the thousands. So our starting point was very much around helping relatively small groups of people with a clear shared purpose just get things done more effectively. It wasn't about opening up, an enormous it wasn't about just opening up something totally public and amorphous that people can just drop in, leave comments and drop out. It was really about, you're entering a space in which to engage with a group in dialogue and deliberation and decision making.
Hey there. Just to build on that question, because Maya started to ask what I wanted to ask. So do you find then that there is never a need for anonymity? So in your example of a CEO using it to make a decision, or basically when that decision gets made, have you heard any feedback about the need for anonymity, or does it seem to work when people identify themselves?
Yeah, again, a really good question. We do get requests for, occasionally we have people asking why Loomio currently doesn't allow for anonymity. I guess the way we've dealt with it is right now when people set up a Loomio account, most people use their real names, but they don't have to. So people do have to use email addresses. Generally, I mean, in most use cases, they're known groups of people that already know each other. They tend to be relatively high trust groups. So in most use cases, there isn't a strong need for anonymity. But in other cases, like there absolutely is a need for anonymity to, there are all kinds of interesting things happening with social dynamics and group decision-making situations. So we're really keen to open up, as we develop, to open it up to those use cases. But currently, we've just been focusing on the most basic use case as the starting point, and then developing features that can sort of scale that out. So I think the ability to participate in decisions anonymously is something that will be coming further down our development roadmap. I think it is a really important thing. But for now, people just have the option to not use their real names if they choose to. But it's totally not set up well for anonymous decision making.
We've got another question coming. Here? Yeah, just right here.
Hi, my name is Yana. I have a question about how you got the first group of people to use your product, and also how you, as a maker of this product and service, how you could actually make it easier to adopt for the users, because like we have so many apps, you have a lot of online accounts. This is one more thing to install, log in, sign up. Like how, when you make such a product like this, how you can make that easier, and also how, like when you got a really brilliant idea product that is finished, how you market it so people start using it, as you have 60,000 people already using it. Yeah.
So I guess on your first question, we still haven't done a good job of making it easy for people to find Loomio, to know what it is. We haven't put any effort into the sort of front of the pipeline. If you look at our online presence, it's really scattered. We've sort of left, while we're still in a beta phase, we haven't focused on growing the user base at all. We haven't pushed to grow the number of people using it. We're really happy to see that it's organically growing, mainly through word of mouth spread, to the point that it has. It's a good size. It's a good sized user base for testing, but we haven't put any effort into really growing it yet. When we do, I think something that's, I don't know, there's all of this literature and all these communities of people online that are really interested in growth hacking. Growth hacking is the terminology they use. So looking at ways of designing products that meet people where they're at, that sort of piggyback off other things that people are already using. And where we see Loomio going, so right now the process for getting value out of Loomio is you have to know about it, then you have to figure out how to set up a group, then you have to invite people into that group, then you have to start a discussion, then you start a decision, and only then do you really get to the sort of core value of what it does. Only then is it really useful, and that's like 5 steps too many. So where we're going in the next phase of development is towards another entry point, which is just you start off with, well, there's a decision that I need to make, so start a proposal from the front page, then think about, well, who do I need to involve in this decision, and just grab them in through Facebook or through email address or through Twitter handle. And I guess for us, there's going to be a lot of work in interoperability, building. It's called an API, an application program interface, basically that will make Loomio exchange information easily with other apps that people are already using. But I mean, the challenge of, we are at this stage of almost saturation for many people in terms of the number of different tools that they're using, the number of different passwords they have to remember. People are really resistant to picking up yet another new tool. And I mean, I am myself, it takes some real convincing. Something that we've seen really successful, I think the reason that Loomio has spread so organically is that when people are invited to try out a new tool without much context, it's really difficult to get them to engage. But when people get an email saying this person wants you to participate in this decision, and it's a decision that affects you, and you can see that to participate, you just need to click one of 4 buttons. Then it's really easy to get engagement. It's a really effective way of mobilizing someone to actually take an action and get involved. So there's something about decision making in particular that because people can see that like my decision about whether or not to participate in this is going to impact on my life. I mean, that's about the most compelling thing you can do. Your other question was, I think, was it about marketing almost, sort of how to get people to, so we haven't been proactive in marketing, and it's essentially been sort of purely word of mouth spread.
Hi, I'm Nazlı. I was wondering if you ever tackle with the government officials, because I know in like when we speak of the like worldwide issues, there are a lot of censorship going on in the Arab Spring countries, and I'm curious, like, because your platform is a great way for people who need their voices to be heard, and they want like governmental officials to hear them. But I don't know if you have ever struggled with any governments. Thanks.
So we haven't had direct sort of confrontation or conflict with any government agencies. What we have seen is in the Hungarian student movement that I talked about. What we saw was in the sort of right at the height of their organizing, of their movement, a pro-government journalist, so a journalist writing for a pro-government newspaper, posed as a student activist, went along to some of their in-person meetings, signed up to their Loomio group, got invited in, and then the next day on the 6 o'clock news in Hungary, there were screenshots of their private Loomio discussions with quotes, sort of cherry-picked quotes, highlighted to give to make the group sound more radical than it actually was, to discredit the movement. So I mean, it's really obvious that governments want to know what activists are discussing in private, and that's been a big part of our commitment to maintaining Loomio as an open source tool, meaning that anyone can take the code and set it up on their own server and take full control over their privacy, the privacy of their data, which I think is a really important part of, if Loomio is a tool that's going to be used by activists and people working in, human rights and people that the governments are antagonistic towards, they need to be able to take full control over their own data, over their own information. But yeah, it's an interesting issue, like what you've brought up. In order for people's voices to be heard by governments, there also does need to be a mechanism for public, transparent public decision making. So it's sort of this. We want Loomio to provide for both. So for Loomio to be as public as people like, right through to as private as they need it to be if they're using it in precarious political situations.
Hello, I'm Ivan. One
Hello.
One of the reasons that I believe that some movements don't move forward that much, or they dissipate later, is that they have so many issues they want to tackle, they have so many objectives, they have so many interests getting together, that since they cannot achieve them all, they feel frustration, then they dissipate. That's what I believe that happened with Occupy Wall Street and Occupy São Paulo and other movements. How does Loomio can help, if you can talk about how it can tackle this extreme diffusion of subjects that sometimes affects groups? And another question is, there are other social movements growing in places where they don't have internet connection, but they have SMS-based communication. I don't know if Loomio, if it's too early to Loomio to start thinking about that, or how do you see these technical limitations in some countries? Thanks.
Yeah, both really, really good points. I guess on the first, in some ways, like Loomio is, it's only as powerful as the cultural context in which it's implemented. It's a tool. It's not a silver bullet. It's just another tool in people's toolkit for the way that they organize. So it's so it doesn't sort of automatically solve group process issues. I guess what it does do is bring down the barriers to and encourage effective, focused discussion and decision making. So by having only one proposal in a discussion at any one time, the whole group is focusing on one topic within one discussion, and that really brings a lot of clarity. And I guess we've attempted to design in features that are specifically about maintaining group focus on a single issue until they've talked it through and come to a clear conclusion. And again, it's totally not a silver bullet. And the broader issue of divergence or different. I guess it's an interesting one, right? In the context of Occupy, like the media narrative constructed around it was, at least in New Zealand, was, well, these people care about so many different things. They're talking about, environmental degradation. They're talking about gender inequality. They're talking about racial inequality. They don't know what they're on about because they care about multiple things. And just the sort of idea that those things are not all connected is, so I think, groups that can agree on a really basic, on a basic shared purpose and then move forward from there, just tend to be much more effective. So I guess our goal with Loomio is to bring that purpose right to the front and get it really clear and have people equipped with tools that allow them to really focus. On your second question, SMS integration is something that that I wish we'd been able to focus on earlier, and it's something that it's in our roadmap for the next year. Because absolutely, the mobile internet penetration, it's increasing really rapidly, but there are still so many parts of the world that realistically in the next 5 years will be primarily, the mobile communication will primarily be SMS. And SMS is just so much more ubiquitous than any other form of digital communication. So SMS integration I think is really important in terms of accessibility and addressing the digital divide and really opening it up in developing countries.
Let's have one more. Yeah, I think we have time for one more. Thank you.
Hi. Can you speak a little bit about your revenue model?
Yeah, sure. So from the beginning, we've been doing consulting work for large organizations that are using Loomio in their work. So we do consulting around, we help government departments develop engagement strategies and do citizen collaboration well. And often they need a lot of help in that. We work with, large organizations, large community organizations that are using it to develop organizational change strategies and to implement Loomio at every level of their organization. We do online facilitation work for organizations that are using it. So people will contract us to facilitate consultations or facilitate just certain groups, either for a short project or for an ongoing period of time. So there's the services side of things. And then there's the online subscription side of things. So, the only way we're really going to scale a revenue model up is if it's online. If it doesn't, the consulting stuff, it's really good for near-term income, but it's much harder to scale than an online subscription system where, where a very large user base can pay a small amount for using it. So the way that we're going with that, we're in an early stage of testing an online commercial user model. So we're groups that sign up, identify as commercial or non-commercial users, and commercial users pay a small per person per month subscription. for using the software. So that's testing well so far, but we're in a really early stage, and the user base is nowhere near big enough for that to fund the project anytime soon. So that's going to be a gradually growing revenue stream over the next period. But yeah, I mean, that's where we're headed. We're committed to keeping it free and open for, you know, community groups and informal networks. We never want money to be a barrier to entry to anyone using it. And at the same time, if commercial use can fund non-commercial use, then that's the ideal situation. Kind of a, I don't know, a Robin Hood model of just people with means pay so people without means can use it.
Great. Ben, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, one more. I think I have 4 minutes.
Okay, Anna, yeah.
Hi, I'm Anna. In your TEDx, you talked about the difference between building transformative rather than revolutionary movements. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess by transformative and revolutionary, and I guess my conception of traditional, when I say revolutionary, I'm thinking of like traditional revolutionary movements that have been about, you know, power being held by a small concentration of people, another small concentration of people seizing that power, but maintaining it in a centralized way that hasn't caused systemic change in a positive direction necessarily. It's just sort of leaving most of the system as it is and swapping out the people who are sitting at the top of it. And that, to me, is a really unappealing model that's been attempted over and over and over again. And I guess I feel like we're at the stage now where we really need systems level transformative change to avert like really significant environmental catastrophe, basically. I mean, I don't know if there's just more and more coming out, like looking at climate predictions, looking at, I mean, the work of people like Naomi Klein, who are, you know, proposing really clearly putting, I think, quite compelling arguments out that massive industrial consumer capitalism supported by the nation-state system they're incompatible with maintaining a healthy climate, with maintaining an ecosystem that's not disintegrating. And so, like, the need for really fundamental systems level change, transformative change, that changes our biggest institutions, the way that our global economy operates, the way that all of our local economies operate, and brings institutions in line with the needs of real people and the physical environment. That's what I mean by transformative change. And I think that's what, you know, the most recent waves of social movements, that's kind of the common theme that binds them together is, and this is why people are talking not just about one issue, but about all of these issues. And what's underlying all of them is that, you know, right now we have these systems that cater to the interests of institutions, but not to the interests of people and the planet. And gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, they all tie into the same, they're all part of the same set of issues. There's this intersectionality between them. It's the same sort of, we have this massive system of systems of oppression that's unsustainable and needs to change at a transformative sort of systems level.
Yes. Amen to that. Well, thank you so much, Ben. That was a wonderful presentation. We have lots to talk about. I think we still have some more questions. Maybe we can email you if there's any pressing question we can't figure out or get through on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone would like help getting set up and getting things up, you know, if people can see use cases for Loomio in their own work, then totally just get in touch. So feel free to share my email address out. Great. Hey, thanks so much for having me along.
Thank you.
I'll see you soon.